Have you got up for a day? To those of you who may be new to opera and you have that stereotypical image of a fat lady with a big horned helmet come to mind, you may wonder, why is it that opera singers always seem to be fat? Well, most of the time they're actually very slim because the industry is kind of toxic. Perhaps that's not the answer you're expecting. Today we discuss where the fat opera singer trope comes from, the physiology of fat, or their lack of when it comes to the voice, and most importantly, body shaming. Before we get into the video, I do want to put a content warning here. We will be discussing issues like body shaming, weight loss, weight gain, and eating disorders. So if you're in a mental space right now where it's not constructive for you to watch this, please click out now. It's important that you look after yourself, and hopefully I'll see you next time with a video that's more suitable for you. So without further ado, let's start with where this stereotype comes from, if it's accurate, and if body mass has any impact on the voice.
It ain't over till the fat lady sings.
Is that one fat enough for you, son?
The history of this phrase is debated, but it's commonly believed it was coined by sports journalist Ralph Carpenter in 1974. If you're interested in the etymology of the phrase, there's a YouTube channel called Today I Learned, and they have a really great video on it, so I'll put a link to that in the description. So basically, it ain't over until the fat lady sings is equated with it ain't over until it's over, or don't count your chickens before they hatch. So basically, wait until the end before you see what the outcome is. But where did the fat singing lady come from then? It's thought that the phrase is a reference to Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, which is a series of 4 operas which runs for around 17 hours. It's basically the pinnacle of how epic opera can be. It's very long, it's very grand, and it's very loud. So think of it as watching the director's cut version of the Lord of the Rings movies. And it is actually inspired by a lot of the same mythology. So if you are a Lord of the Rings fan, you may also like the Ring Cycle as well. Now, the final opera in the series is called Götterdämmerung, or Twilight of the Gods, which is about 4 hours long, and it ends with a 20-minute aria from Brunhilde. Brunhilde, for whatever reason, has become what we think of when we think opera singer in pop culture. And her costume is traditionally the big horned helmet with the breastplate and the spear. She fat though. So pre-Wagner, operas were on a much smaller scale. So the opera houses were smaller, the orchestras were smaller, and the instruments themselves in the orchestra were softer. So in general, the physical demands on the singers were less. So then we move into the Romantic era of music in the 1800s, and composers then started to write works that called for much larger orchestras of up to 100 players or more. And also the opera houses became bigger, and the instruments in the orchestras by that point were pretty much what we have in the modern day, and they are significantly louder. So given the scale of things, singers also had to become much louder, keeping in mind that opera singers don't use microphones, but we still need our voices to be heard over the orchestra and to the back row of people in the opera house. Typically, larger voices come in larger frames. So whilst voice classifications are determined by the anatomy of the vocal folds and the larynx themselves, there is also an element of the size of the resonating cavities, so things like the head and the chest. So it makes sense that most of the time, dramatic voices who sing these kind of works are often larger in stature. Whilst the singers themselves might generally be a bit larger, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're fat. If anything, opera singers are almost always very fit regardless of their size. Opera is hard. So not only are you using your entire body to sing some very vocally demanding music, you're also moving around the stage at the same time. So personally, there have been multiple times where I've been in a production and the director has said, okay, the big climactic part is coming up. I want you to be at the top of this staircase or this hill or whatever it is. So basically when there's a big high note, They want you in an epic part on the stage, so up high. Now the thing with this is that you often need to climb some stairs before you sing your high notes. So operas, they're usually between 2 and 3 hours long, sometimes longer, so they require a lot of physical stamina. You absolutely need good cardio health. Claudia Friedlander has a great video called Stop Body Shaming Opera Singers, which I'll link down below, you should check it out. And she has a quote in there that I love: form follows function. So the point is, athletes look a certain way depending on their sport, right? So long distance runners are going to have a very different physique to, say, like powerlifters. And this is because their body has been cultivated by their training to be the best that they can be at that particular thing. Now the same thing goes for singers. If someone is showing immense artistry and technique and stamina on stage, their body is already perfect, developed for what they're doing, because they're already doing it, right? So size isn't really a factor in that at all. Not to mention, it's a mistake to automatically conflate skinniness with health and fat with laziness or being unfit. If an opera singer is fat and they're running around on stage and singing like an absolute dream, I can guarantee that they are super fit. Let's have a quick look if fat actually affects the voice. Now, there was one study that postulated that extra fat around the larynx could contribute to greater resonance. But this was just one study and it wasn't particularly conclusive, not to mention that the neck, it's not really a place where fat is held easily, so you'd have to be quite big all over for that to be a benefit. Where fat is a more concrete advantage though is its relationship with breath support. If you want some info on the mechanics behind breath support, you can check out my video Explore the Core. I can link them up here in the eye for you. When a singer has more fat, there is a gravitational pull that affects the function of breath support. Now, all singers cultivate the muscles in their core to regulate the pressure in the thoracic cavity, otherwise known as subglottic pressure. So that's basically the pressure above and below the level of the glottis. Efficient singing requires mastery over the subglottic pressure. So with this gravitational pull of viscera, supporting the voice becomes a bit easier. There's a common saying that singers either need to be fit or fat for this reason. But the reality is there is always a degree of fitness in singers regardless of their body fat percentage. Where this becomes an issue is if a singer loses a significant amount of weight, particularly if they lose it quickly. So if you're cultivating your instrument, working within certain parameters, and then suddenly those parameters change, it's almost a little bit like learning how to sing again. If you're used to a degree of passive gravitational pressure aiding your breath support when singing, and then suddenly you don't, it can be a little bit of an adjustment to then connect with the support and ensure that those muscles are really nice and developed. There are many examples of singers' weight loss over the years that many believe have contributed to a decline in their voice. A famous example of this is one of the most celebrated sopranos ever, Maria Callas. So towards the middle of her career, she started receiving pressure from colleagues to lose weight, and she did indeed lose a huge amount of weight, about 45 kilos, and it's often attributed to a dangerous tapeworm diet. If you listen to her earlier recordings and compare those with the ones that are at the peak of her fame when she was a lot slimmer, you can hear quite a change in her voice. And unfortunately, her career did finish quite prematurely. Another example is soprano Deborah Voigt, who was fired from the Royal Opera House in London in 2004 for being too fat for the dress. Because apparently we're supposed to fit clothes and clothes aren't supposed to fit us. So she actually used her severance pay to have gastric bypass surgery and lost about 50 kilos. Her voice also changed significantly after this time, and she too retired after a few years. I'm going to put another Friedlander quote in here from her book Complete Vocal Fitness, A Singer's Guide to Physical Training, Anatomy and Biomechanics. When opera singers prioritize aesthetics over function, it is counterproductive at best and destructive at worst. Our bodies are our instruments, so any change to our form will have an impact on our function. Like other athletes, it's great to optimize our strength, flexibility, stability, stamina, and range of motion in ways that will help us perform better, but doing so may or may not impact our weight or dimensions. However, for an opera singer, pursuing weight loss as an end in itself is extremely reckless and foolish. An industry professional should really know better than to wantonly encourage singers to thus risk the integrity of their instruments. So these stories about Callas and Voigt prove that even the most famous opera singers in the world are not immune to body shaming. And it is rampant at all levels of the industry, starting even in the conservatoires and teaching studios. Bodies are not products and they are not fashions. We happen to live in a culture where right now it's considered conventionally attractive, this whole ideal of beauty, and that's the Instagram slim thick figure. The fashion changes every decade, mind you. Contrasting to this current beauty standard, fatness is often associated with being unattractive, unhealthy, undisciplined, and ultimately undesirable, despite these traits having literally nothing to do with weight at all. Pointing out someone's weight does not help. We are bombarded daily about what our bodies should look like and reasons why we shouldn't feel like we're enough. To target someone's insecurities further is just plain damaging. Being a certain body shape isn't the rent that you pay to exist in the world. Think about what behavior that fat shaming can lead to. So if you feel that you're too big, you're going to try and make yourself feel smaller. Your posture's going to be affected and you might feel like you have this constant need to suck in your stomach. So aside from the psychological hurt that this creates, how the hell is this supposed to help someone singing? Singing is highly psychological when it comes to our technique, and breaking someone's confidence down with comments about their weight is going to make it very difficult for them to achieve efficient alignment in their singing. And on a wider scale, the stigmatizing that fat shaming creates increases a person's risk of weight cycling, eating disorders, and depression. It's theorized that body shaming has become intensified at the top tier opera companies with the advent of HD broadcasting. Singer Tracy Cox has an interesting insight on this, saying that this technology led the shift to cinema towards the idea that we have this limited, misogynistic, idealized beauty on screen to get people in seats. And that's how we're going to save opera in the 21st century. The goal of these companies with big budgets is to try and reach wider audiences, particularly of younger generations. And part of this understanding is that these audiences are very image conscious and might be attracted to opera if they hire Hollywood-looking singers. Opera is wild. So much crazy shit happens. And on top of this, the stories often revolve around characters who historically would be teenagers or people who are dying of tuberculosis. But there are huge vocal demands on the singers, and they're usually going to sing this repertoire when their voices are in their prime, which oftentimes doesn't happen until our 30s or our 40s. So definitely not teenagers. As opera audiences, we suspend our disbelief not only with some of the more ludicrous plot points, but also when it comes to characterization. It's impossible to cast an actual teenager or someone dying of a respiratory disease in an opera. In fact, some of the most intense singing comes at a point when the character is dying. Often casting directors will argue that a part needs to be believable and will cast a slim person as a romantic lead. So, are you telling me that I'm supposed to believe that Azucena in Verdi's Il Trovatore, she throws her own baby into the fire by mistake, thinking that it was someone else's baby, was she meant to do, oops. But it's unbelievable that a fat person could have a love life. Can we take a moment to reflect on how stupid that is? Yeah. To be fat or skinny is not a reflection on character, nor is it a reflection on how worthy someone is of love. Whilst body shaming is something that affects both male and female opera singers, there is a particular venom that female presenting singers receive. This comes particularly from theatre critics. And keep in mind the phrase is when the fat lady sings. You'll be able to find examples easily online when the cruelty has gone a step too far and critics have received backlash for their comments. You will rarely hear a man's appearance commented on in a review, only his performance. For women, the artistry will sometimes be completely ignored and comments like this will be published. Now, I'm not particularly fat. I mean, the BMI scale is silly, but if we use that just for argument's sake, at my heaviest, I've been in the lower segment of the overweight category, but most of the time I've been at the higher end of normal. And I feel this is my set weight where I sit naturally. I did notice when I moved to Germany and I started seeing productions that all the sopranos were white and very thin. And as I was researching agents and looking along their roster, I'd go to the soprano section and again, all white and all very slim. And when I would go to auditions, despite not being overweight, I was always the biggest girl there. During my studies and a few times auditioning, I was told to keep an eye on my weight, that my size was okay given the repertoire that I sing, which is more of the dramatic stuff like Wagner, but to make sure that I don't gain any weight. So just looking around me, I felt immense pressure to look a certain way, and in 2019, I lost 20 kilos. Now let me tell you, I was pretty miserable around this time. After having a healthy relationship with food and my body for my whole life, I started developing disordered eating. I did an audition in London where I was told, oh, thank God you lost weight. And keep in mind, I have never asked for feedback on what I look like in these situations. These are comments that people have felt entitled to make about this meat sack that I just exist in. These are professional situations, and I can't really think of another industry where someone can make comments like these and not get in trouble. Like, it's just so bizarre that comments like this are so normal in opera. So during Corona, I had a few health issues and it made me gain back some of the weight, but I was also doing a lot of work on self-love to heal the relationship that I have with my body. The lifestyle I had when losing weight was not healthy, and it was important that I change my lifestyle to one that serves all aspects of my health and something that's sustainable. I wanted to offer my experience just to illustrate that body shaming can also happen to people who aren't necessarily plus size. But that being said, I can't speak as an authority on fat shaming because I haven't lived my life as a plus size person. If you are someone who's plus size in the opera world and you feel it would be helpful to share your experience, I'd love to hear some of your stories down in the comments. I don't want to leave this video on a gloomy note, especially considering it's World Opera Day, which is a celebration of opera. And despite the problematic elements of the industry, opera really is such an amazing art form, and I absolutely live for it. And I know many of you who have stayed to the end of the video will likely feel the same way. So what can we do to empower ourselves and ensure that opera is for everyone? Firstly, I think it's important to note that music tends to really lag behind when it comes to the cultural zeitgeist, and it always has. When you think about art movements throughout history and look at the dates, literature and visual art always kind of lead the way, and music has always taken a bit of time to catch up. And this is usually by about 30 years or so. This lag is what we are experiencing now. The world is changing and the art world is reflecting that. In due time, music will follow. In cinema and literature especially, we are seeing more diversity in leading characters. Fat people no longer exist just to be villains or comic relief. Where we're currently at, when these roles in cinema are cast diversely, it's often seen as a political statement. But over time, this novelty will wear off, and seeing people of different body types and different races will become the norm. Keep in mind that although there are people on the front line fighting for diversity, ultimately, the big changes come down to money. It's one thing to be an idealist and want change to happen because it's the right thing, and being a realist looking at how the world works. The good news is that audiences want to see themselves represented on stage. So as we can see in cinema, films that cast diversely are well received and they bring in audiences. We want to feel connected with the people that we see on screen or on stage. And seeing stories about the same type of person over and over and over and over again is boring. Not to mention, it's not balanced and it's not real. As it currently stands in most of the opera world, most of the casting directors, sponsors, and people in power are usually white, male, and middle-aged. Now, opera has been on the decline for many years now, and the people who make the decisions think that the way to move forward and bring in new audiences is to almost exclusively hire singers who fit into a very narrow idea of beauty. They're not yet privy to the fact that diversity does indeed bring in new audiences. I have a prediction that with the whole discussion around diversity being primarily spearheaded by millennials, that by the time millennials are in these more powerful positions, that we will see diversity in opera as more of a political statement. And then by the time Gen Z takes those positions, it will be normalized. So what to do? If you find yourself in a position of power in the industry, use it for good. If you are in a panel or hiring position, it is your responsibility to break down social barriers and cast diversely. And it isn't just reserved for people in these positions either. If you're a singing teacher, you also have a responsibility. There's a definite power dynamic in the teacher-student relationship. Especially with singing, we can't see inside our instrument, and our voice, it sounds really differently to ourselves than it does to others. So we rely heavily on the words of our teachers for guidance. Teachers have often been victim of shaming themselves throughout their development, and they may pass on these judgments to their students because they think it's the right thing to do. They may see it as being honest about the industry and perhaps bringing up weight loss or some other thing that pertains to a singer's appearance rather than their artistry, that this may be a form of tough love. No, I personally believe that tough love is a bit bullshit and it does more damage than good. I mean, you don't yell at a flower to make it grow, you nurture it. I think empathy and understanding can go a really long way. If you want what's best for your student, do not stigmatize them. Body shaming is something that can end up being cyclical. If you're in this position, you can make a decision that this abuse ends with you. Fat shaming comments do not help. Singers have very thick skins because we take criticism all the time, but the distinction between constructive criticism and being abusive is an important distinction to make. If you're an opera goer and passionate about this issue, you can email your local company and praise when they cast diversely. And if they don't, question them why. Companies will often listen to audiences who keep them financially afloat. And if you aren't familiar with opera at all and you have no idea where to start with opera, feel free to reach out. I am very happy to point you in the direction of something that you might like. I promise, it's basically like Netflix when it's done well. I was thinking of perhaps starting a story time segment with opera plots. If that's something you're interested in, leave me a note in the comments. The themes in opera are of universal struggles, and that's why it's withstood the test of time so far. I think presenting these stories in colloquial language or, spilling the tea on opera plots, so to say, it might be a way of helping new people connect with opera. Because really, opera is the ultimate form of storytelling, keeping in mind that operas, they combine literature, they combine music, acting, costume, lighting, sets, dancing, everything. If there's an opera in particular you'd like me to cover, let me know. I know I've torn opera to shreds a bit in this video, but it's important to separate the art form from the industry. Yes, the industry can be problematic, but opera itself is absolutely magical. It can really speak to something inside us that words themselves can't reach. If you're in a position to, make sure you go and support your local artists by going to see them sing in person. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you next Monday. Bye.